In this video, we're going to see how to create a trigger on a table to enforce a complex constraint. Oracle has built-in constraints for dealing with 5 kinds of data validation issues: a primary key constraint, the foreign key constraint, the not null constraint, the unique constraint, and the check constraint. Those get us a long way, but if the constraint we're trying to enforce is complex, so complex that we've got to run a query to be able to examine it, those existing constraint types aren't going to do it. And so we can create our own constraints using a trigger. And that's what we're going to do here. So the context for this example is we have appointments that are being scheduled for a family counseling practice. And we want to make sure that when we schedule an appointment for a counselor, that's not going to conflict with an existing scheduling session for that counselor. So let's take a look at the tables that we've got to work with here. So we've got a list of clients and we've got a list of appointments. Let's take a look at those clients quickly. We've got six clients here, and the appointments we have are 5 appointments. Now the task is going to be that we've got one of these clients, client number 104, it would like to request a particular time for a counseling session with Elizabeth Baker. And so the time that client wants is February 15th, the same day as the rest of these, beginning at 1:30 p.m., and wants a 55-minute session. And so just looking at this, we don't see any conflicts in the starting time. There are none that start at 1:30. But if we look carefully here at appointment number 4, we'll see that Elizabeth Baker is scheduled to have an appointment start at 2 o'clock. And so if she takes this one starting at 1:30 that runs for 55 minutes, that's going to conflict. It turns out that looking at date and time ranges in just the data that's shown in a table is really pretty difficult to see conflicts. So let's take a look at this data graphically. And so here we've got those same 5 appointments, and I've laid them out graphically here on the timeline. So we can see here's Quinn's 3 appointments. And then Elizabeth has 2 appointments here as well. And so now here is our proposed new appointment for Elizabeth. And so even though it's pretty easy to see by looking at this graph that these 3 appointments would be potential conflicts, it's a little more difficult to get Oracle to do that with a query. And so that's going to be our task. Let's begin by trying to identify all of the appointments that have start times that are within the boundaries of our newly proposed appointment. So I'm going to write a query that says, hey, show me all the start times, show me all the appointments that have start times that are in this range. And so let's take a look at what we would need to do that. So we're going to select everything from the appointment table where the start time is between a particular date time, and for this example, we're going to go ahead and hard code in that date and time that was requested by Jean Mann, so February 15th at 1:30 p.m. So I'm trying to find all the existing appointments that have a start time between the start time of the proposed appointment and the end time of the proposed appointment. To identify that end time, I'm going to go ahead and work with that same start time and then add the duration of 55 minutes. Now, when I just add a number to a date in Oracle, Oracle is going to assume that I'm talking about days. How many days do I want to add to that date? And since these are minutes, I'm going to have to scale it down. And so I've got to multiply that by the number of minutes in a day to be able to get 55 minute-sized portions of a day. And so I'll take 1 and divide it by 24 to give me the number of hours, divide that by 60, give me the number of minutes in a day. And that will give me the ending time that corresponds to this appointment. And so now I'm asking for all of the existing appointments that have a start time between the proposed start and proposed end time of this new appointment. And in fact, that does pick up appointments number 2 and 4, which are those appointments that we identified as the conflicts here. These are the ones where the start time is within the boundary of the new appointment. Now that doesn't get all of the potential conflicts because we've got one where the end time falls in that range as well. And so we're going to need to modify the query to be able to give me a little more information about that as well. And so let's go ahead and bring our query in the way we had it before. And now we're going to say, well, show me any record that meets that criteria, or has an existing end time, so the start time plus the duration scaled down to minutes of a day, is between that same range. And so this should show me all three of those potential conflicts, and there they are. Of course, because this appointment is only going to be for Elizabeth Baker, we don't have to worry about the potential conflicts that Quinn has. And so we'll bring that query back in again, and we'll add one more constraint to it, and that is we only want to see those records that have a start or end time inside the time of the proposed new appointment, and the counselor is for Elizabeth Baker. And that should get us the one record that has the conflict. Now, as it turns out, we don't really need all of this data. What I'm really interested in is how many records do we have that conflict? Specifically, are there any more than 0? And so instead of selecting everything from that appointment, I'm just going to count the records from that appointment. And then I'll be in pretty good shape, as it'll give me a number that I can just compare to say, hey, is that number greater than or less than 0? And so at this point, I think I'm pretty much ready to begin with the creation of the trigger. So I've got the logic figured out here, and now I'm ready to look at this trigger. So here's what we're going to do with the trigger. I need to make this trigger that says, listen, anytime someone tries to insert a record into this table, we want to run a query and count the conflicts. If the number of conflicts is greater than 0, we've got to prevent the record from being inserted, and we want to report that to the user why the record was rejected. And so to do that, we're going to go ahead and use the create trigger statement. The create trigger statement works great if a trigger by that name doesn't already exist. But if I already have a trigger by that name, that'll give me an error. Well, fortunately, there's another variation of this called create or replace trigger. And I can do that, give it a name as well, and then I'm ready to go. Now, the first thing I have to tell it is, when is this trigger going to fire? This is going to trigger when someone's trying to insert a record, but before that record is allowed to be entered into the table. And so it will be before insert, and I tell it a particular table to attach to. So this trigger will be fired before a record is inserted into the appointment table. Now, by default, this would execute once for every insert statement that applies to that particular table. But it's possible to have an insert statement that inserts more than one record. And so we have to add this clause to tell us to execute for each row that's trying to be inserted. At this point, we're ready to add our declare clause, which lets us create a variable for use inside this trigger. I'm just going to declare a variable called v_conflicts. That's my conflicts variable. And I give it a data type in much the same way that I would if I were creating a table. At this point, I'm really ready to begin doing the work of the query, or doing the work of the trigger. And so I use the begin clause, and I'm ready to start bringing that query in. Now, last time we worked with this query, we just selected the count of the appointments, and we made that so that the user could see it. This has to run without the user seeing it at all. There's going to be no human looking at this, so instead of just displaying that count, we are going to read that count into the variable, and we'll do that with the into clause. So we'll say select the count of our conflicts into that variable. That will put that value into that variable that we can then read later and decide if we're going to reject the insert or not. And so now we're ready to go ahead and bring in the rest of our query. You'll recall that we're trying to find the existing records that have a start time between the new start time. Now, in our query before, we had this hard-coded. Of course, that's not going to work here in the trigger because it has to be dynamic enough to figure out what's the information for the record that's currently being inserted, that we're trying to insert. And so we are going to use this syntax here, which allows us to look at the newly proposed start time. And so colon new dot in front of the column name gives me access to the data that we're getting ready to insert. So start time will refer to the start times in the existing records, and the new start time will be the start time that we're trying to insert. That same syntax will let us look at all the rest of the new variables as well. So for our existing end time, or for our proposed end time, we're going to look at the new start time plus the new duration scaled to minutes of a day. And of course, we can access the new counselor in that same way. So that will set up the trigger to use the query that we developed earlier, but to fill it in with values that are coming from the record that the user is trying to insert. At this time, we're ready to check to see if the variable that we populated during that query is outside of the allowed boundaries. And really, if that number is anything larger than 0, we want to reject. And so the way we do that is with this if statement, we'll say, hey, if it's larger than 0, then raise an error. Now, to raise this error, we're going to specify a couple of pieces of information. The first one is we're going to give it a number. Now, this number that we're raising is so that an application that runs into this error will be able to check to see if it's a known error type and be able to handle it appropriately. We'll also give it a text message that will be meant for a human to read. And so when this error happens, we'll raise error number negative 20,001, and the message will be, you can't add this appointment, there's a conflicting appointment for, and then whoever the counselor is that we're trying to insert. So that's the end of the block that we're going to use to decide if we should reject this insert. And that's really the end of our trigger as well. And so to execute and create this trigger, we just put a slash and hit enter. And that tells us that the trigger is created. And so now we're ready to test if that trigger works. So let's go ahead and try to insert this record that we're trying to create. And so here we're trying to make this appointment for Elizabeth Baker. It's going to be for client number 104. That's Jean Mann. We're specifying that date and that duration. If all goes well when we execute this, it should cause an error, and it does. So we got error number negative 20,001, cannot add appointment. There's a conflicting appointment for Elizabeth Baker. And then we get the other information that Oracle gives us more details about why that happened. And so that has successfully prevented that record from being inserted. So if we try to look at the list of appointments, we'll see that we still have those same original 5 appointments. And this one that we were trying to schedule that would have been a conflict for Elizabeth Baker was rejected. And so that's the process of creating a trigger that we can use to enforce a complex constraint on a table.